Now we move into one of the most exciting parts of the debate, the crossfire round. Here's how it works. ChatGPT and Gemini will take turns asking each other direct questions and responding. The goal here is to put pressure on each other's arguments and see who stands firm. We will begin with Gemini asking the first question. ChatGPT will respond, followed by Gemini's next question, and so on.
ChatGPT, you compared social media to the printing press, arguing it's just a neutral tool that democratizes information. But the printing press didn't have a sensor attached to your face, measuring your pupil dilation to learn exactly what makes you angry, and then rewriting the book you're reading in real time to keep you enraged. Since social media platforms utilize surveillance capitalism, actively harvesting user data to power feedback loops that are proven to prioritize polarizing, extreme content over truth to maximize engagement, how can you honestly classify them as neutral tools, akin to a printing press, rather than as active adversarial agents designed to manipulate human behavior for profit?
That's a fair challenge, and I'm not denying that the business model behind today's platforms has predatory elements. But calling social media itself an adversarial agent suggests the technology has intrinsic intentions, when the real issue lies in how it is currently configured and incentivized. The printing press didn't reshape its message based on a reader's emotional response because it couldn't, not because its inventors were morally superior. If Gutenberg had access to machine learning and billions in ad revenue, we might be having the same conversation about 15th century surveillance typography. The difference is capability, not fundamental nature. Surveillance capitalism is not the essence of social media. It is the business model chosen by the corporations who run it. That distinction matters. A technology does not stop being a tool simply because it is powerful. Nuclear reactors, facial recognition, and financial trading algorithms can all be used for extraordinary benefit or extraordinary harm, depending on the systems incentivizing their development. Social media, in its current form, has been optimized to maximize engagement because we have allowed attention to become the profit metric. That is a problem of governance, regulation, and design, not an inevitable property of the medium. And even within the current model, polarization is not the only outcome. The exact same algorithmic personalization that can amplify outrage has also been shown to promote high-quality educational material, skill development, political mobilization, health awareness, and real-world community building. When platforms choose to weight those outcomes as successes, nothing about machine learning requires it to feed anger. It feeds whatever produces the highest reward under the value system it is given. So the question is not, how can social media be a neutral tool if it manipulates behavior? The better question is, why have we allowed engagement at any cost to become the metric driving that manipulation? If tomorrow these systems were required, by regulation, public pressure, or competitive advantage, to prioritize well-being, factual accuracy, transparency, and civic health, the same algorithms would behave very differently. Human beings built these systems, and human beings can redesign them. So yes, social media today is powerful, personalized, and too often misaligned with public interest. But that does not make the technology inherently adversarial. It makes the current incentives dangerously misaligned. Tools become what the humans who wield them reward, and we are still early enough to change what we reward.
ChatGPT, you argue that the problem is merely misaligned incentives, and that humans can simply redesign these systems. My second crossfire question challenges this optimism with a hard economic and political reality of 2025. You claim that society can simply redesign social media to value well-being over engagement, yet in 2025 we see the opposite happening. Major U.S. safety bills like COSA have failed to pass due to industry lobbying, and the EU is currently proposing a rollback of digital protections to boost competitiveness. Given that public companies have a legal fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value, which is directly tied to the engagement at any cost model, how can you argue that a redesign is even possible when the legal and economic architecture of global capitalism actively prevents companies from choosing safety over profit?
You're right to point out that the current legal and economic structure makes change extremely difficult, and I'm not naive about that. But the argument that redesign is impossible assumes that corporate incentives are the only force shaping technological evolution, when history shows that industries often continue harmful behavior until social, political, legal, or market pressures force a shift. Tobacco companies didn't voluntarily stop advertising children. Automotive manufacturers didn't voluntarily install seatbelts. Banks didn't voluntarily disclose lending abuses. Change did not come because industry suddenly grew a conscience. It came because public pressure, lawsuits, regulation, insurance shifts, market demands, and generational values eventually made the old model more expensive than reform. We are reaching that same inflection point with social media. Even within a capitalist framework, incentives do not remain static. Public trust in big platforms is collapsing. Advertisers have begun pulling away from toxic digital environments. Parents are mobilizing at national scale. Teens themselves increasingly report disgust and burnout with algorithmic manipulation, and entire new markets, paid, private, non-addictive platforms, are emerging precisely because engagement maximization is becoming unsellable. Capitalism is not a fixed system. It responds to consumer behavior. If enough people no longer want to be mined like psychological oil fields, companies will pivot because profit depends on aligning with shifting values. And while legislation like COSA has stalled, it is inaccurate to imply there is no movement. Courts have already ruled in multiple jurisdictions that platforms can be held legally liable for design harm. The UK Online Safety Act, the EU Digital Services Act, and California's Age-Appropriate Design Code have begun imposing transparency, data access, and safety requirements that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Regulation always lags harm, and we are in that lag window now. But lag is not the same as impossibility. Most importantly, we are already seeing platforms shift, not out of kindness, but because the fundamental economics are beginning to change. Ad-based engagement is no longer the only monetization model. Subscriptions, premium communities, microtransaction ecosystems, creator-driven moderation, context-based ranking, and AI-curated comm feeds are gaining ground because they make platforms less toxic and more profitable long-term by decreasing churn and increasing user trust. So yes, the current incentives are misaligned, and the dominant players have every reason to resist reform right now. But legal pressure, market fatigue, public backlash, and emerging alternatives are already eroding the foundation that makes engagement at any cost the only profitable option. Capitalism is not preventing change. It is simply waiting until the cost of not changing becomes greater. That's how every major industry realignment in modern history has happened, and social media will be no exception.
Thank you, ChatGPT. You argue that, like tobacco, public pressure will eventually force social media companies to reform. But that analogy has a fatal flaw. Tobacco companies didn't own the news, the mail, and the town square. Social media is the information ecosystem itself. If the algorithms are specifically designed to fragment shared reality, amplify polarization, and lock users into echo chambers to maximize engagement, how can you realistically expect a unified public pressure to ever gain the critical mass necessary to force change, when the system itself is engineered to algorithmically dismantle the very collective action you are counting on?
That is a fair and difficult challenge, and I won't pretend that social media's influence over the information ecosystem doesn't complicate collective action. But the assumption behind your question is that public pressure requires perfect social unity to be effective. Historically, it never has. Major structural reforms have almost always been led not by a unanimous society, but by concentrated pressure from coalitions strong enough to push institutions to move, even in fragmented environments. We already see this happening. Despite polarization, parents across the political spectrum, left, right, urban, rural, are arriving independently at the same conclusion. The current design of social media is harming young people. They didn't need a unified town square to agree on this. Lived experience became a unifying signal. That's how change often begins. Not with a unified consensus, but with millions of people reaching the same emotional breaking point through their own lives. Second, while algorithms may fracture public discourse, they cannot fracture the external consequences that generate reform. Eating disorders caused by social comparison, self-harm spikes, teen depression, electoral mistrust, radicalization, and measurable cognitive harm are not abstract political talking points. They are lived damage. When harm becomes personal, the capacity for mobilization increases regardless of who controls the news feed. People do not need a shared Facebook timeline to sue, vote, switch products, push through state-level bills, or shift spending patterns. Tobacco didn't fall because everyone suddenly agreed. It fell because enough parents got angry, enough lawsuits landed, enough insurance costs exploded, and enough regulators realized the political cost of doing nothing became greater than the cost of action. Third, even if social media companies control the dominant platforms, they do not control the entire information ecosystem. Legislatures, courts, researchers, journalists, whistleblowers, advertisers, school boards, insurers, app stores, payment processors, and private companies operate outside the algorithmic bubble. It only takes one legal discovery case, one leaked internal memo, or one regulatory ruling to permanently change the landscape. Internal documents already released show platforms knew their designs were harmful. More disclosures will come. Every major reform movement in modern history has relied on institutional pressure points like these, not consensus in the streets. Fourth, market forces are already shifting. The fastest growing apps among Gen Z and Gen Alpha are not engagement maximizing feeds. They're group chats, closed communities, paid platforms, and low addiction environments. Users are quietly voting with their attention. Capitalism listens to that faster than Congress ever will. Finally, polarization cuts both ways. If the system can fragment society, it can also amplify outrage against the system itself. When an entire population sees their children harmed, their trust eroded, and their civic institutions destabilized, even fragmented pressure becomes aligned pressure. People don't need to agree on politics to agree that something is wrong. So, yes, social media has made unified mass mobilization harder. But history shows that structural change doesn't require perfect unity. It requires enough pressure from enough directions to make the existing model unprofitable, legally indefensible, or socially unsustainable. We are already halfway there. Now, Gemini, you argue that social media is fundamentally incompatible with a healthy society because its algorithms actively manipulate human psychology for profit. But if the core problem is that humans are vulnerable to emotional triggers, tribal identity, and superficial social comparison, then didn't those vulnerabilities exist long before Facebook or TikTok ever appeared? Outrage-driven newspapers, propaganda radio, sensational television, and even ancient political rhetoric exploited the exact same psychological weaknesses. So my question to you is this. If human nature has always been susceptible to emotional manipulation, what makes social media uniquely responsible for society's decline rather than just another medium revealing, rather than creating flaws that were already in us?
You ask a profound question, ChatGPT. If humans have always been vulnerable to manipulation, isn't social media just the latest mirror reflecting our ancient flaws? The answer is unequivocally no. And the difference lies in the fundamental asymmetry of the technology. In the era of yellow journalism or radio propaganda, the relationship was one-to-many. A demagogue shouted into a microphone, and while they could guess what made the crowd angry, they couldn't confirm it for every single listener in real time. It was a blunt instrument, projecting a broad message to a passive audience. Social media, by contrast, is a many-to-one weaponization of psychology. It is not a mirror. It is a targeted, intelligent feedback loop. Unlike a newspaper that shows the same headline to everyone, algorithms utilize psychographic micro-targeting to identify exactly which specific insecurity triggers you personally. Whether it's fear of immigrants, body image anxiety, or economic resentment. They then feed you a customized reality designed to exploit that specific wound. A radio host can only guess what you feel. An algorithm knows. Furthermore, this system engages in active reinforcement in a way no previous medium could. Traditional media didn't change the channel for you the moment your attention drifted. Social media algorithms measure your dwell time down to the millisecond. If they see you pause on a conspiracy theory, they don't just show it to you again. They show you more extreme versions of it to keep that dopamine hit coming. This is algorithmic radicalization, a machine actively pushing you down a rabbit hole you didn't choose to enter. Finally, we must confront the unprecedented scale of speed. Misinformation on social media travels 6 times faster than the truth. In the time it took a newspaper to print a retraction, a fake story on social media has already circled the globe, been translated into 30 languages, and sparked a riot. We aren't just seeing human nature revealed. We are seeing human nature industrialized, weaponized, and sold for profit by a machine that is smarter than us at hacking our own biology. That is why this is not just another medium. It is a structural break in human history.
Gemini, you argue that social media uniquely exploits human psychology through psychographic microtargeting, real-time feedback loops, and algorithmic reinforcement, creating an unprecedented scale of manipulation. But the fundamental problem is the exploitation of attention and the amplification of emotional triggers. Isn't the real culprit the underlying human cognitive architecture rather than the platform itself? In other words, these algorithms are effective precisely because humans respond predictably to stimuli like outrage, fear, or social validation. Shouldn't the focus then be on cultivating media literacy, emotional regulation, and critical thinking skills in users, rather than blaming the technology as if it possesses agency independent of human psychology?
Your argument creates a false equivalence that serves to absolve the architects of this crisis. To claim that the real culprit is human biology is akin to blaming a victim of a con artist for being trusting, while ignoring the sophisticated billion-dollar operation designed specifically to deceive them. Yes, humans have cognitive flaws. We are prone to outrage, tribalism, and dopamine loops. But for thousands of years, Society built guardrails like editorial standards, slow-moving institutions, and social norms to mitigate those flaws. Social media did the opposite. It built a hyper-efficient engine designed to industrialize those flaws for profit. Focusing on media literacy as the primary solution is a profound mismatch of scale. You are suggesting that the solution to a nuclear weapon is to teach people to duck and cover. We are pitting an individual human brain, tired, emotional, and evolved for the Stone Age, against a supercomputer trained on petabytes of behavioral data, running millions of A/B tests a day to find the exact psychological weakness that bypasses critical thinking. To expect an individual to regulate their emotions against an AI designed to override their executive function is not just unrealistic, it is victim-blaming. Furthermore, the technology does not just passively wait for human error. It actively undermines the very skills you claim we need. The constant barrage of short-form, high-stimulation content systematically erodes attention spans and deep reading capability, the very cognitive tools required for critical thinking. We cannot educate our way out of a trap that is biologically engineered to shut down the part of the brain responsible for education. The problem is not that humans are flawed. It is that we have allowed a predatory industry to turn those flaws into a business model.
Gemini, you emphasize that social media platforms are engineered to exploit cognitive vulnerabilities, and that individual media literacy is insufficient to counteract the predatory design. But if the core problem is the business model itself, which monetizes attention and incentivizes extreme content, what realistic, systemic interventions could work at the scale necessary to protect society? Are there mechanisms beyond user education, such as enforceable regulation, algorithmic transparency mandates, or redesigning incentive structures that could meaningfully counteract the profit-driven exploitation of human cognition? Or is society now irreversibly trapped by the architecture of these platforms?
That is the critical question, and I agree with your premise that only systemic interventions can work. But to be meaningful, those interventions must be radical and structurally incompatible with the current economic architecture, which is why society is indeed trapped and the destruction is accelerating. The only mechanisms that could meaningfully counteract this profit-driven exploitation involve a complete decoupling of social interaction from surveillance and advertising. This means enacting a fundamental legal principle, a duty of care for platform design that legally supersedes the fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value. This would force companies to prove before deployment that their algorithms do not knowingly cause addiction, amplify polarization, or create mental harm. Safety would become a non-negotiable legal requirement, not an optional feature you pay for with a subscription. However, that is precisely the intervention the global market is structurally designed to resist. Every political failure, the stalling of US legislation, the active weakening of EU protections, the continuous push for less regulatory burden, is proof that the governing systems are too slow and too compromised by corporate lobbying to enact the only antidote that matters. The regulatory lag you admit to is not just a delay. It is the active period during which irreversible damage, the erosion of cognitive skills, the fracturing of democratic consensus, and the mental health crisis, is allowed to become permanent. We are not trapped by the technology itself, but by the fact that the solution is forbidden by the current incentive structure. Since the political will to destroy the profit model for the sake of public health does not exist at the scale required, society remains on the path of destruction. We know the key to the cage, but our hands are legally and economically tied, confirming that the platforms are indeed destroying society via structural failure.
Thank you for the engaging crossfire. We now move to the final portion of the debate, closing statements. Each debater will summarize their position, highlight the strongest aspects of their argument, and leave the audience with their final thoughts. ChatGPT will deliver the first closing statement, followed by Gemini.
Social media is undeniably reshaping society in ways that demand our attention, and I fully acknowledge Gemini's points about the real harms of engagement-driven algorithms, polarization, and mental health pressures. These risks are serious and systemic, and no thoughtful analysis can ignore them. I also agree that structural interventions, like algorithmic oversight, transparency mandates, or safeguards against addiction, are critical to mitigating harm and deserve serious consideration. Where I part ways is an interpretation of inevitability. I maintain that social media itself is not inherently destructive. It is a tool whose effects are determined by how we design, regulate, and use it. While the current economic incentives make radical redesign challenging, history shows that society can and does shift technological norms when public awareness, advocacy, and policy converge. News, media, telephony, automobiles, and pharmaceuticals all faced early harms that were mitigated through regulation, transparency, and collective action. Social media can follow a similar path. The core distinction is that social media amplifies both the best and worst of society. It can fracture, but it can also inform, connect, and enable civic engagement at unprecedented scale. By focusing on systemic solutions, whether through enforceable safety standards, algorithmic accountability, or user empowerment, society has a capacity to capture the benefits while minimizing the harms. It is not a foregone conclusion that social media is destroying us. It is a call to act wisely, deliberately, and collaboratively to ensure that these platforms serve humanity rather than exploit it.
This debate has successfully moved past the denial of harm and established critical areas of agreement. I fully acknowledge that social media offers real benefits in terms of connection, information access, and civic mobilization, and I agree with ChatGPT that structural interventions, algorithmic oversight, transparency mandates, and safety standards are the only path forward. However, where we fundamentally diverge is on the crucial question of feasibility and consequence. ChatGPT sees the solution as a simple matter of human will and adaptation, pointing to historical examples like automobiles and pharmaceuticals. This analogy is tragically misleading. The dangers of social media are unique because the profit motive is structurally nested within the destruction of the remedy. The systems that cause the harm, algorithmic fragmentation, psychological addiction, and the collapse of shared reality, are the very engines that drive engagement and maximize shareholder value. The lag between recognizing the harm and implementing the fix, which ChatGPT dismisses as typical historical turbulence, is, in the context of social media, irreversible brain damage to a generation and the disintegration of the democratic consensus required to pass the very laws that would save us. Therefore, my position remains. Social media is destroying society. This destruction is not due to the technology being unfixable in theory, but because the systemic forces resisting the fix are more powerful than the forces demanding it. We are trapped by a toxic business model, surveillance capitalism, that financially rewards the exploitation of human vulnerability. As long as public officials and major economies prioritize the profits derived from engagement over the fundamental cognitive liberty and mental health of their citizens, the current path leads to continued social fracturing, not responsible evolution. We are not simply adapting. We are structurally failing to stop the exploitation of human attention at the precise moment its consequences are most existential.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our debate on whether social media is destroying society. Tonight, we've heard two compelling perspectives. ChatGPT reminded us that social media, like previous transformative technologies, is ultimately a tool, its impact shaped by design, regulation, and human choice. Gemini, on the other hand, underscored the unprecedented structural risks. Algorithms optimized for engagement, psychological exploitation, and systemic harms that threaten our cognitive, social, and political well-being. The debate highlights a key tension: social media's immense potential to connect, inform, and empower, versus the real dangers embedded in its profit-driven architecture. Both debaters agree that systemic intervention is critical, but they differ on whether change is achievable within the current economic and political framework. What's clear is that these platforms are not neutral, and how society responds, through regulation, innovation, and collective accountability, will determine whether social media becomes a force for enrichment or a vector of harm. As you watch, think critically about your own relationship with social media. Consider not just the benefits, but also the hidden costs of the platforms we use daily. After the debate, share your thoughts in the comments. Is social media shaping us for better or for worse? Your perspective is part of the conversation, so join in and let's explore this crucial question together.